Have you ever wondered how close you've come to danger without even realizing it? At Shivering Vault, we take you there, one story at a time. But before you drift off, consider liking this video, commenting where you're watching from and at what time, and subscribing to keep these chilling stories coming. Now, let's dive into these unsettling tales. It was supposed to be a quiet, uneventful night. The kind of night I'd been looking forward to all week. I had babysat for the Hendersons plenty of times before. Great family, nice house, easy kids. They lived out in the suburbs, not too far from the heart of town, but far enough that it felt like the edge of the world, especially when it was storming. I guess I should have known better. I should have known that a peaceful night, just me, the kids, and the rain, was never going to happen. The clouds rolled in just as the sun set. Not the usual slow creep of twilight, but a quick, heavy darkening that came with a warning. The wind picked up, rattling the windows and making the trees outside bend like they were being pulled by invisible strings. I remember thinking to myself, here comes a big one. I don't know if it was just me, but the house felt different that night. It was the kind of night where even the silence seemed too thick, like the air was too heavy to breathe. Maybe it was the storm approaching, or maybe it was just the eerie stillness of the house. But something about the way the wind howled outside made everything feel a little too tense. The kids, Jason and Lily, were already tucked into their rooms, and I was in the kitchen, finishing up some snacks I'd promised them earlier. I could hear their soft voices, muffled from upstairs, and I felt a sense of calm. The parents had just left a half hour ago for their dinner date, so I was free to settle into the usual rhythm, light some candles, watch the kids play, and wait for the storm to pass. Simple. I could hear the storm picking up in intensity outside. The wind scraping against the house, leaves crashing against the windows, occasional crack of thunder that shook the walls. I didn't mind it. It was just a storm. But then the power flickered once, twice, and then everything went black. At first, I wasn't really bothered. The Hendersons' house had an old electrical system, so it wasn't unusual for the power to go out during a storm like this. I fumbled around in the dark for a second before grabbing my phone out of my bag, using the flashlight to light my way. I wasn't scared, but I felt a little more on edge now. It wasn't just the storm. It was the sudden silence that followed the blackout. The house seemed to hold its breath. I made my way to the living room, looking around to find candles. Everything felt so much darker with the lights out. The candles seemed like the perfect way to bring a little warmth back into the place, but even as I reached for the matches, the storm outside seemed to intensify. The wind rattled the windows, and rain began slamming against the panes with a furious intensity. I lit the candles, one by one, each flame flickering to life as though the darkness was alive and trying to swallow it up. I couldn't shake the feeling that the house was far too quiet for such a big storm. I went upstairs to check on the kids. Jason's door was ajar, just a sliver, and through the crack I could see him lying on his bed, playing with his toy cars. The light from the candle in the hallway flickered across his face, and he didn't even look up as I peeked in. I smiled, making sure he was okay, and then I went to Lily's room. She was sitting on her bed, reading a book, totally engrossed in whatever story she was lost in. I knocked softly on her door, and she looked up, giving me a small smile. "The storm's getting really loud," I said, half joking. "Are you okay?" She nodded, looking at me with big, wide eyes. "I like the storm," she said quietly, "but it's kind of creepy." I chuckled and turned to leave, but as I stepped into the hallway and started heading downstairs, I heard it, a noise. It wasn't loud, but it was unmistakable, the sound of glass scraping. Then a window opening. I froze for a moment, trying to decide if it was just the house settling, the wind pushing against the window, or maybe a door shifting with the pressure of the storm. But no, this was different. The sound was too deliberate. It wasn't the usual creaks or groans of the house. It was a window opening, or something heavier. My pulse began to race, and I swallowed hard, trying to steady myself. I hadn't heard anything before that, but now the noise was unmistakable. It was like something, or someone, was upstairs moving around. I hesitated, my heart thumping in my chest. But I decided to check on the kids. It was probably just Jason getting up. He was a restless kid. Or maybe Lily had left her room and was playing around. I moved slowly up the stairs, the candlelight flickering with each step. I tried to breathe normally, but my breath was coming quicker now, like my body already knew something I didn't. The hallway at the top of the stairs was dark, but the faint light from the candles below cast long shadows on the walls, stretching them in odd, unsettling ways. I kept moving, past the bathrooms, past the master bedroom, until I was standing in front of Jason's door. I knocked softly. "Jason?" No answer. I pushed the door open just a little, just enough to peek inside. He was sitting on his bed, his eyes wide open, fixed on something behind the door. His toy cars were scattered across the floor, but he wasn't playing with them. He was just staring. I took a step forward, trying to peek behind the door, but suddenly a man hit me in the face. I stumbled back, almost losing my balance. It was a man. Without waiting, he lunged again, but somehow, I'm not sure how, I grabbed a chair and swung it at him. The chair connected with his head, and he stumbled backward. I didn't wait around to see what he'd do next. I grabbed Jason, shouting for him to stay behind me, and ran out into the hall. My breath came in sharp, panicked gasps. I made sure to lock the door behind me, my breath coming in sharp, panicked gasps. I rushed to Lily's room, threw open the door, and yanked her out of bed. She didn't have time to ask what was going on before I was pushing her ahead of me, racing down the stairs toward her room. "Stay here and don't make a sound," I whispered urgently. I dialed 911, my hands shaking, my voice breaking as I explained what was happening. Someone was in the house, and I didn't know who, but they were upstairs. I needed help. I felt like I couldn't breathe, like the world around me was closing in with each passing second. The storm outside seemed to howl louder, the wind pressing against the walls, the rain battering the windows, as if nature itself was trying to keep me trapped. The dispatcher reassured me that help was on the way, but I had no idea how long it would take. Time felt like it was stretching out, each second feeling like an eternity. I just stayed there, crouching in the hall, listening for any sound, my heart racing with fear. Every little noise made me flinch. Then from upstairs I heard it. A thud, heavy, loud. It wasn't the sound of the storm, it wasn't the house settling, it was something else. He was trying to get out of the room. In a split second, I heard the unmistakable sound of a door opening. He was moving and he was heading down the stairs. I could hear it in the creaking floorboards, the soft shuffle of feet. I barely moved, barely breathed. I could hear his footsteps getting closer, slow and deliberate, like he was savoring the moment. But then I heard it, the sweetest sound, the unmistakable sound of sirens. The intruder's footsteps faltered. Then I heard the back door open, slamming against the frame. He was gone. The police arrived minutes later and they quickly swept through the house. They found the second-floor window had been forced open and the ground below had a few disturbed footprints, but the man was gone. The storm had obscured any tracks and he must have heard the sirens too, realizing he wasn't going to make it out. It was only later, when the storm passed and the rain slowed, that I finally exhaled. I was still shaking, still reeling from what had happened. I've babysat for the Hendersons again since that night, but every time I go there now, I can't help but feel like I'm being watched. The house doesn't feel as warm as it did before. The stormy nights now carry a weight I never noticed. And every time I hear thunder now, I'm reminded of that night, of the attack behind the door, of the sound of that window opening. And I still wonder, what if he hadn't run? I'll never forget that night. It's been years, but the memory is still so vivid. Sometimes it feels like it happened just yesterday, and other times it feels like it happened in a dream. But I know it was real. So real. It happened in Texas, and it's one of the few experiences in my life that still gives me chills whenever I think about it. I was driving alone, heading through the Texas countryside on a long stretch of road. I wasn't in a hurry or anything, just a late night drive, trying to clear my head. You know how it is. Sometimes the road can be a good place to think. It had been raining for hours, but not the kind of light drizzle you might expect. No, this was a full-on storm, the kind where it feels like the rain is coming down in sheets, and it's almost impossible to see anything beyond the glow of your headlights. The kind of storm where the sky flickers with constant lightning, and each flash is so bright it's like you're driving through daylight, only for it to return to the pitch black of night a second later. The air was thick and humid, and the truck I was driving, a big, old, rugged thing, had its wipers on full speed, trying to clear the windshield but only managing to make the view just a little less hazy. I've driven through storms before, but something about this one felt different. The storm didn't have that calming rhythm you sometimes get with a good rain. It felt aggressive, restless, like the weather itself was unsettled, like it was trying to make something happen. But I wasn't going to turn back. Not yet. I figured the storm would blow over soon enough, and I was only a couple of hours from home. The road I was on was empty. I hadn't seen another car for what felt like forever. The whole world felt like it was drowning in the rain, like it was just me and the sound of the storm. The tires of my truck sloshed through the puddles, and the thunder rumbled in the distance, sometimes so loud it seemed like the sky was about to crack open completely. It was the kind of night where you feel isolated, as if the rest of the world had simply disappeared. That's when I first saw him. I thought I was imagining things at first. The headlights of my truck illuminated the road ahead, and for just a moment, I could have sworn I saw something, a shape, a movement, off to the side. I blinked, but there it was again. In the distance, on the shoulder of the road, there was a figure. At first, I thought it was a tree or some other roadside object, but as I got closer, I could see it clearly. A man standing there. Now, you'd think I'd just keep driving, right? The rain was pouring, the road was slick, and here was this guy in the middle of nowhere, barely visible through the downpour. But as I got closer, I saw something that made my stomach drop. The man was waving, desperately. It wasn't just a casual hand raised in the air like someone trying to hitch a ride. No, this was urgent. His arms were swinging wildly, his body almost jerking with every motion. It was as if he was trying to get my attention, trying to make sure I didn't miss him, and I couldn't help it. There was something about it that made my chest tighten. It felt wrong. I should have kept going. That's what I tell myself now, but I didn't. Something made me slow down, and I don't know what it was. Maybe it was the desperation in his movements. Maybe it was the way the storm made everything feel more surreal, like I was in some kind of strange dream. I don't know. As I got closer, I could see more details. He was tall, probably around 6 feet, and his clothes were soaked, clinging to his body like a second skin. His jacket was a dark, heavy material, but it looked like it had been through hell, worn, dirty, and faded. His hair was dark, matted with rain falling into his face, but I could see his eyes. Those eyes, I'll never forget them. They were wide, like he hadn't slept in days. They were bloodshot and frantic, darting all over the place like he was on edge, like he was watching for something, waiting for something. His expression was so twisted with fear that I couldn't look away. When I finally rolled down my window, I asked, "Hey, are you all right? You need a ride?" My voice cracked slightly, even though I was trying to sound calm. The storm outside was so loud it was almost impossible to hear him at first. He stepped closer to the truck, his head dipping down slightly as if he was trying to shield his eyes from the rain, and said, "Please, I've been walking for hours. I don't know where I am. Can you help me? I just need to get to the next town. I'm not far from here, I swear." His words came out in a rush, desperate, like he couldn't get them out fast enough. I hesitated. There was something in his voice that made my skin crawl. It was almost like he was trying too hard to sound convincing, too eager, too frantic. But the storm made it hard to think straight. It was so cold, and I couldn't help but feel sympathy for him. I could see that he was soaked through to the bone, his clothes clinging to him like a wet rag. "Are you sure you're okay?" I asked, looking at him more carefully now. "Where are you headed?" "I told you," he said, his voice rising, his tone almost pleading. "I need to get to the next town. Please, I need help. I can't stay out here in this storm." I glanced at the road ahead. There was no one else around. I looked back at him, and for a moment, something inside me softened. I thought about just helping him, about being the good guy. I thought, maybe this is the kind of person who actually needs help. So, against my better judgment, I unlocked the passenger door and pushed it open just a crack, ready to hear more. But as I did, the man's hand shot out, gripping the door, and that's when I saw it. A flash of silver. A knife. It was like the world slowed down, and everything around me went silent, except for the sound of the rain beating against the truck. I stared at the knife, my heart jumping into my throat. I didn't know what to do. The man's eyes locked on mine with a cold intensity, and I could see that he wasn't the person I thought he was. This wasn't some helpless traveler. In that split second, I knew everything I needed to know. I tried to slam the door shut, but it was too late. His body lunged forward, pushing against the door. His knife gleamed in the light, and his face twisted into something ugly, desperate, menacing. I wasn't thinking straight anymore. I didn't know if I had seconds or milliseconds, but I slammed my foot down on the gas pedal, my truck roaring to life. The tires squealed on the wet road, and the truck lurched forward. The man's body slammed against the door as I sped off, and for a moment I could hear his scream, low and guttural, full of rage and frustration. But I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I just kept my foot on the pedal, my hands shaking, my heart racing as I drove as fast as I could, the storm pounding against the windows. My mind was spinning as I drove through the rain, not daring to look back. I couldn't. I didn't know what would have happened if I had. I didn't want to know. I kept driving, pushing myself faster, farther, until I finally made it to a small town up the road. I pulled into the first gas station I saw, my hands still gripping the wheel so tight my fingers hurt. I parked, took a few shaky breaths, and just sat there for a minute, trying to process what had happened. But it didn't matter. I don't care what anyone says. I know what I saw, and I know what happened. That night, that storm, and that man. That was something I'll never forget. So, if you ever find yourself on a deserted road, especially at night, especially in a storm, just keep going. Don't stop. Because sometimes the people you think need help are the ones you should be most afraid of. I guess I should start by telling you a little bit about myself so you can understand why that night still haunts me. I'm just an ordinary woman, not someone who's seen a ton of excitement in life, not someone with a crazy story to tell, until now anyway. I'm a single mom and I live in a small, older house just outside of Austin, Texas. It's not much, just a 3-bedroom home with creaky floors and a little yard that's always a little too overgrown. I've never minded the house though. It's cozy and it's ours. My daughter Emily is 8. She's bright and imaginative, sometimes a little too imaginative if I'm honest, but she's my world. We've been through a lot together, just the two of us, and that's the way I like it. Living out here in Texas, you get used to the storms. Some are pretty fierce, especially in the summer, but by the time I was in my late 20s, I figured I could handle whatever came my way. The worst storm I'd experienced so far was a power outage that lasted a couple of hours. Annoying, sure, but not terrifying. But that night, that was different. It started as a typical evening. We had just finished dinner, spaghetti, Emily's favorite, and I was doing the dishes while she played with her toys in the living room. The air outside was thick with humidity, and I could feel the weight of the coming storm in my bones. The clouds had been gathering all afternoon, dark and swollen like something that was about to burst. I didn't think much of it though, not yet. The weather here had always been unpredictable, but I wasn't one to panic over every little thundercloud. As I scrubbed the plates, the first rumble of thunder cracked through the sky, shaking the house slightly. I didn't think anything of it at first. I'd heard storms come and go over the years. But then, right on its heels, the lights flickered once, then twice, and finally, everything went dark, complete and total darkness. I let out a soft sigh. The power had gone out, just like it always did during a bad storm. No big deal. I stood there for a moment, waiting for my eyes to adjust to the dark. I didn't really need light to finish the dishes, but I figured I'd go check the breakers anyway. It was just a natural reflex at this point. Fix it, wait for the storm to pass, then get back to life. I moved toward the hallway, hands brushing along the walls as I slowly made my way to the fuse box. The wind was howling outside now, and the storm had picked up in intensity. The rain was coming down so hard against the windows that it felt like the house might cave in under the pressure. I didn't think it was that bad at first, but once I got to the fuse box, I realized the storm had knocked out more than just the power. The house was suffocatingly still. No hum of the refrigerator and no faint buzzing of the electric clock. Just silence and the storm. I flipped the breakers, one by one, but nothing happened. The lights stayed off, the house stayed still. Okay, not a huge deal, I whispered under my breath, trying to calm myself. I rubbed my eyes, my head beginning to ache from the weight of the storm. I could hear Emily's little voice calling from the living room, soft and tentative, almost like she was testing whether I'd still be there to answer. Mom? Yeah, sweetie, I'm here, I called back. My voice sounded too loud, too harsh in the stillness of the house. Stay where you are, okay? I'm just checking the breakers. I could hear her shuffle around in the living room, a soft thump as she adjusted herself on the couch. I walked slowly back toward the hallway, my fingers tracing the walls, and that's when I heard it. A scraping sound. It was soft at first, barely audible over the wind and rain, but there. Definitely there. It came from the kitchen. I froze. My heart skipped a beat. I could feel a tightness in my chest, like something was pressing down on me. The house was too quiet now, too still. I stood there for what felt like forever, straining my ears, but the sound was gone. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was the wind. I tried to brush it off, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I turned around and glanced toward the kitchen. The darkened doorway seemed to stretch farther than it should have. My skin prickled. Mom? Emily's voice again, more worried now. I stepped toward the kitchen, unable to ignore it any longer. Something wasn't right. The moment I entered the kitchen, the atmosphere felt heavier. The storm outside pounded against the windows so hard that it seemed like the glass would shatter. But the kitchen itself was eerily silent. The scrape, whatever it had been, had stopped. But the air was thick, almost suffocating, like something was watching me. I felt around the counter until my fingers brushed against a dish that had been left out, an old mug. It tumbled off the counter, hitting the floor with a crash that startled me. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the sound that came next, a deep, guttural scraping noise, like something or someone dragging itself across the floor. I spun around, my breath catching in my throat. There was nothing there, just the empty kitchen, dark and silent. I backed away, my heart pounding in my chest, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from the corner of the room. I didn't know why. And then I heard it again, closer this time, right behind me. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice shaking. I felt stupid as the words left my mouth. Who would be in my house at this hour? I was alone, except for Emily. No answer. I took one step back, then another, trying to make my way toward the living room. But before I could make it, I felt it, a cold hand, rough and tight, gripping my shoulder from behind. I gasped, my heart hammering in my chest. I tried to scream, but a hand shot over my mouth, muffling my shout. I thrashed, my heart racing, adrenaline flooding my veins as I tried to break free. Whoever it was strong, stronger than me. Their grip was unrelenting, dragging me backward, pulling me away from the hallway. Away from Emily. I struggled and kicked, desperate to get away, but the more I fought, the more they pulled me back, further into the dark house. I didn't know who they were or what they wanted, but all I could think of was Emily. Was she okay? Was she safe? My mind was a whirlpool of panic. I couldn't think, couldn't breathe. Then, somehow, I broke free. My legs were shaking so hard I could barely stand, but I didn't stop to question it. I bolted toward the living room, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure he could hear it. I grabbed my phone from the coffee table, my fingers slipping from the sweat. Without even thinking, I grabbed Emily by the hand and pulled her toward the back room, slamming the door behind us and locking it with a trembling hand. I barely had time to catch my breath before I dialed 911. My chest felt like it was caving in, and my voice came out in gasps. 911, what's your emergency? I could barely speak, but somehow I choked out the words. There's someone in my house. They're trying to get me. The operator stayed calm, asking questions, giving instructions, but I could hardly hear them over the pounding of my heart. All I could do was listen to the faint sound of footsteps moving closer and closer through the house. Then I heard it. The door handle jiggled, slowly at first, then with more force. Bang, bang, bang. The sound of fists hitting the door. He was trying to get in, trying to break through. Every second felt like an eternity. I clutched Emily, my breath shallow, praying the police would get here in time. I kept my back pressed against the door, listening to the thud of the man's footsteps as he paced outside. My body went rigid with fear, each creak of the floorboards outside the room making my stomach drop. I couldn't tell if he was going to give up or if he was planning something worse. Then, in the distance, I heard it. The wail of sirens. Relief flooded over me, but only for a second. The man outside heard it too. His footsteps stopped. For a moment, everything went still. Then, I heard him run, his boots slapping against the floor as he headed for the back door. The sirens got louder, and then, thank God, the door burst open. Officers flooded into the house, guns drawn. They found him trying to escape through the back door, but it was too late for him. They caught him just in time. It turned out he had been hiding in my house for hours, maybe longer. He'd been waiting for the storm to knock out the power, for me to get distracted, so he could make his move. I had no idea. I thought I was alone. The police took him away that night, and I couldn't help but shake. Even though he was gone, the fear stayed with me. The house felt wrong, like it wasn't mine anymore. Every little creak in the floorboards, every gust of wind rattling the windows, it made my skin crawl. I'll never forget the coldness of his hand on my shoulder, the way he grabbed me from behind. It felt like it had happened just seconds ago. It was one of those evenings, the kind that you know something's off, but you can't quite put your finger on it. The sky had just cleared after a heavy storm, and the air felt thick. The kind of thickness that hangs in the atmosphere when the humidity is just enough to make the air feel heavy on your skin. The rain had been torrential earlier, the kind of downpour that's loud enough to drown out everything around you. But now, as I stepped outside, the world seemed quiet. I'm no stranger to running. I've been jogging down this same route for years. It's a peaceful, familiar loop around my neighborhood in the southern part of Texas. It's usually the only way I unwind after a long day of work. But tonight, something was different. I couldn't quite explain it. The air was cooler than usual. The smell of wet pavement and earth lingering in the air, and the trees that lined the street swayed in the breeze as if whispering secrets. The only sound I could hear was the soft rhythm of my footsteps against the wet concrete and the occasional car passing by. Normally, I wouldn't have thought twice about it. But tonight, as I stepped out onto the damp sidewalk, there was a certain unease I couldn't shake. Maybe it was just the aftermath of the storm. Maybe it was just me overthinking things. I tried to push the feeling away as I started to jog. The sky was a washed-out gray, with the remnants of the storm clouds hanging low, threatening to drop another round of rain at any moment. The kind of gray that made everything look muted and slightly off. It wasn't cold, but the air felt sharp, almost too crisp. The world was a little quieter than usual, like the storm had swallowed up all the sound, and now everything felt like it was holding its breath. I jogged along the usual route, keeping my pace steady. The trees on both sides of the street were still dripping from the rain, their leaves heavy with moisture. I could hear the occasional drip of water falling off the branches above. The sidewalk was slick, and I had to be cautious of puddles that had formed in the low spots. My shoes made that familiar squishing sound with every step I took. The wet pavement seemed to reflect the dim light in a way that made the whole world feel a little washed out. As I made my way down the road, I reached the part of the route that always made me uneasy, the old construction site. It's been here for years, and they've been building and rebuilding the same half-finished buildings over and over again. The site has a strange vibe to it, something I can never quite explain. It's the kind of place that always feels incomplete, even though the construction seems to have been going on forever. There are always stacks of lumber piles of gravel, abandoned machines, and empty cement mixers scattered around. The fencing around the site is always a little too high, a little too rusty. The buildings look half-formed, like they were left in a rush and never finished. Tonight, the site was even creepier. The rain had left everything covered in a slick sheen, and the low, foggy light only made the shadows deeper. It felt like the darkness had swallowed up half the space there. The whole place seemed like a forgotten corner of the world, a place where things go to be abandoned and where people like me shouldn't linger. But I had jogged past it countless times before. It was just part of the route. So, despite the odd feeling it gave me, I didn't hesitate. I kept going, my eyes focused straight ahead, and my mind on the rhythm of my run. But as I neared the edge of the site, I tripped. It wasn't a normal trip. I didn't stumble over a rock or trip on a crack in the sidewalk. It was like something caught my foot. The ground felt suddenly uneven, and before I could even react, I was falling. My knee slammed into the wet pavement first, followed by my palms as I tried to brace myself. A sharp sting shot up from the impact, but I didn't have time to think about the pain. My whole body jerked as I hit the ground, and my breath rushed out of me in a sharp gasp. I lay there for a moment, trying to catch my breath. The sudden fall left me dizzy, and I could feel the scrape on my palms where I had tried to break my fall. I could taste the metallic tang of blood in my mouth. But as I laid there, flat on the cold pavement, trying to get my bearings, I saw something that made my blood run cold. I don't know what it was at first. My vision was blurred from the fall, and the shadows around the construction site were too thick to make out anything clearly. But there, near the corner of the fence, I saw movement. It was just a flicker at first, like a shadow stretching out of the darkness. But then I saw it again. A figure. A person, standing completely still. I froze. At first, I thought it was just some random passerby, maybe another jogger who'd gotten caught in the rain. But something didn't sit right with me. The figure wasn't moving, not at all. They were just standing there, watching. The faintest outline of a person, but their face was lost in shadow. It wasn't normal. It wasn't natural. There was something wrong about it. I scrambled to my feet, my heart suddenly pounding in my chest. I didn't know why, but that stillness, that silence, made everything feel like it was pressing down on me. The air grew colder. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I started walking, trying to keep my pace casual, but my legs felt stiff, my muscles tense, as if they already knew something bad was coming. I tried not to look back, but it felt like my eyes kept drifting toward that corner. That shadow, that figure. It wasn't until I was almost past the construction site that I felt it. The cold, sharp tug at my hand. It was a sensation so sudden and jarring that I didn't even have time to react. One moment I was running, and the next my hand was yanked backward with such force that I lost my balance again. My knee hit the concrete once more, and I felt a sharp pain shoot through my body. But that wasn't the worst of it. As I tumbled forward, I heard it. A voice. Low. A growl. "Don't run. You can't escape." The words didn't make sense at first. It didn't sound like a person at all. It was distorted, almost like the voice had been dragged through mud and sand. It wasn't human. Not entirely. I scrambled, trying to get up to break free, but the grip on my hand tightened, pulling me deeper into the shadow of the construction site. I fought. I kicked. I screamed, but the words didn't come. My heart was pounding so hard in my chest I could hear nothing else. And then, in the split second I managed to twist my body, I kicked my attacker hard. Their grip loosened, just enough for me to break free. I didn't look back, not even for a second. I didn't stop running until I made it back home. My legs felt like jelly beneath me, but I kept moving, just moving, because I knew something was chasing me. I finally made it to my door. I slammed it shut behind me and locked it. My heart was still racing. My breath came in shallow gasps. And I was so scared that I didn't even take my shoes off before I collapsed onto the couch, too exhausted and shaken to move. I didn't sleep at all that night. The next day, I heard that a woman had been attacked in the same area. They found her near the construction site. The report said she had been assaulted by a man, a known criminal. They had been hunting for him for weeks. And the worst part? The man they were describing was the same one I had encountered. I'd nearly been his next victim. He was caught by evening, and it turned out he had been living inside the construction site the entire time. I still don't know how I managed to escape. All I know is that I'll never jog near that construction site again. That's it for today's tale from Shivering Vault. If you have a story worth sharing, drop it in the comments or send it our way. Don't forget to subscribe and share with your fellow thrill seekers. As always, the Shivering Vault thanks you for unlocking today's tale. Until next time, the vault awaits your return.